In the quiet darkness before dawn, long before the sound of children filled the little schoolhouse, the teacher would wake slowly beneath heavy blankets while the countryside still slept. The room was cold. Not the sharp cold of a sudden winter wind, but the deep, patient cold that settles into wooden walls during the night and waits there until morning fires begin to breathe warmth back into the house again. Outside the small window, the land remained covered in darkness. The fields stretched silently beneath a pale sky where only the faintest hint of morning had begun to gather. Trees stood still against the horizon. A thin layer of frost rested over the grass like scattered white dust. The teacher opened tired eyes and listened for a moment. There was almost always something to hear if one remained quiet enough. The creaking of old wood settling gently in the cold. The distant shifting of a horse inside a barn. Wind brushing softly along the outside wall. Sometimes rain tapping lightly against the roof. Sometimes complete silence. In the early 1800s, silence was common in the countryside. Real silence. Wide and peaceful. The kind that wrapped itself around lonely roads and sleeping farms during the final hours before sunrise. The teacher sat up slowly. Blankets folded back carefully. Feet lowered onto a cold wooden floor. A small breath rising into the dim air. Many school teachers during those years lived very simply. Some rented tiny rooms from farming families. Some stayed with relatives. Others boarded near the schoolhouse itself, moving from one home to another through different seasons. Very few had much money. Teaching was respected work in many communities, but it did not bring comfort or wealth. The pay was small. The hours were long. And yet many teachers continued quietly year after year, guiding children through lessons beside smoky stoves and drafty windows. The teacher reached for clothing laid neatly over a chair nearby. Nothing fancy. Wool garments worn smooth from many winters. Carefully mended sleeves. Boots repaired more than once. A shawl for colder mornings. Thick socks stitched by hand. Clothing in the countryside needed to last. Every button mattered. Every piece of fabric mattered. The teacher dressed slowly in the darkness while the house remained still around him. If the teacher stayed with a farming family, other members of the household would soon begin waking as well. The farmer rising before daylight to feed animals. A mother preparing breakfast near the stove. Older children gathering buckets or carrying wood indoors before school. Life in rural America followed the rhythm of work and weather. Morning arrived early for everyone. A small lamp might be lit beside the bed. The soft flame flickered gently against the walls, painting warm gold light across rough wooden boards and simple furniture. Shadows moved quietly through the room. The teacher brushed hair carefully and washed with cold water from a basin nearby. During winter, the water could feel painfully cold against tired hands and sleepy skin. Ice sometimes formed along the edges overnight. Still, the morning routine continued. Outside, the darkness slowly softened into gray. The first rooster called somewhere far across the fields. Another answered in the distance. Then another. The teacher moved toward the kitchen or common room where breakfast was already beginning. The smell of smoke drifted gently through the house. So did the smell of bread warming near the fire. Breakfast during the 1800s was plain and filling. Farmers, laborers, and teachers all depended on heavy meals to carry them through long hours of physical work and cold weather. There might be oatmeal cooking slowly over the fire. Fresh biscuits if flour was available. Cornbread. Salt pork. Potatoes left from the evening meal before. Sometimes eggs. Sometimes only bread and weak coffee. In poorer seasons, meals became smaller and simpler. Hard winters could strain entire communities. Crops failed sometimes. Roads became difficult. Supplies ran low. But the morning still arrived each day. And the teacher still prepared for school. The teacher ate quietly while dawn slowly widened outside the windows. In many homes, conversation during early morning remained soft and brief. Everyone still waking fully. Everyone preparing mentally for the work ahead. The crackling stove often filled the silence. The teacher might glance over lesson notes while eating. Small pieces of folded paper. A reading passage copied carefully by hand. Arithmetic exercises prepared for older students. Books were valuable during those years. Not every child owned one. Not every schoolhouse had enough. Teachers learned to reuse paper carefully and protect every resource they had. A spelling lesson might remain in use for weeks. Readers passed from one student to another. Slates replaced expensive paper whenever possible. The teacher gathered these materials gently into a small satchel or bundle. Then came the walk. Or sometimes the ride. But most often, the walk. The teacher stepped outside into the cold morning air while the countryside slowly awakened around them. Breath drifted softly in front of the face. Boots pressed into frozen ground. The eastern sky now carried faint streaks of pale silver and faded blue. The road toward the schoolhouse stretched quietly ahead. Dirt roads crossed nearly every rural community in early America. They twisted through farmland, woods, hills, and shallow streams. During dry weather they became dusty beneath wagon wheels. During rainy seasons they turned thick with mud. In winter they hardened into frozen paths marked by deep ruts. The teacher knew every inch of the journey. Every fence post. Every large stone beside the road. Every crooked tree leaning over the ditch nearby. Morning after morning, year after year, the same path unfolded beneath steady footsteps. The world moved slowly then. That slowness shaped everything. People rose with sunlight. They traveled at the pace of horses and walking feet. Darkness ended most activity at night. Storms could isolate entire towns for days. And somewhere within that quiet world stood the small schoolhouse waiting beyond the fields. As the teacher walked, the countryside slowly revealed itself beneath growing daylight. Thin smoke rising from farmhouse chimneys. Cows gathering near fences. Bare tree branches moving gently in the wind. A dog barking far away. Sometimes snow falling silently across empty fields. Sometimes spring rain dripping from fresh green leaves. Each season changed the teacher's journey in its own quiet way. Winter brought icy roads and frozen fingers. Spring brought mud deep enough to pull at boots with every step. Summer covered the fields in soft green waves beneath warm sunlight. Autumn filled the roadsides with dry leaves that rustled softly beneath passing feet. The teacher noticed these things without hurrying. There was time to notice things in the 1800s. Time to watch birds lift suddenly from fences. Time to hear distant wagon wheels before they appeared. Time to smell rain approaching across open farmland. At last, somewhere ahead, the schoolhouse slowly came into view. Small. Simple. Weathered by years of wind and snow. Most rural schoolhouses held only one room. One teacher. One stove. One blackboard. And children of many ages learning together beneath a single roof. The building usually stood alone beside the road or near a cluster of farms. A few trees might surround it. Sometimes there was a small woodshed nearby. Sometimes only open land stretching outward in every direction. The teacher approached the door quietly. The schoolhouse was cold inside during the morning. Very cold. The fire from the previous day had long since faded into gray ash inside the iron stove standing near the center of the room. Before students arrived, the teacher needed to wake the building itself back to life. The door opened with a soft creak. Cold air rested inside the empty room. Rows of wooden desks stood quietly beneath dim morning light coming through narrow windows. Chalk dust covered parts of the blackboard. The floor carried faint marks from muddy boots and yesterday's lessons. The teacher set down books and supplies. Then immediately began preparing the fire. Wood first. Always wood first. Some schoolhouses required older boys to chop wood as part of their duties, but the teacher often handled the morning fire alone. Logs were carried from the woodshed nearby. Small pieces of kindling arranged carefully beneath larger pieces. Hands moved slowly in the cold. A match struck softly. Then flame. Small at first. Barely alive. But slowly the fire caught hold of the wood. A crackling sound filled the room. Thin smoke rose upward through the stovepipe. And little by little, warmth began spreading through the schoolhouse again. Not quickly. Never quickly. Old schoolhouses remained drafty through winter. Children sitting close to the stove sometimes grew too warm while others near the windows kept coats wrapped tightly around themselves all day long. But even weak warmth felt comforting against the cold morning air. The teacher held hands near the stove briefly before beginning the next task. Cleaning. Dust settled constantly inside rural schoolhouses. Mud tracked across the floor. Ash gathered near the stove. The teacher picked up a broom and swept slowly beneath the desks while daylight continued growing stronger outside. The sound of sweeping echoed softly through the empty room. Back and forth. Back and forth. Simple work. Quiet work. Outside, the first students were beginning their journeys too. Small figures appeared far down the road carrying books, lunch pails, or pieces of wood for the fire. Some children walked alone. Some arrived with brothers and sisters. Some came laughing loudly through the cold air while others remained shy and silent. A few traveled miles each morning. The teacher paused near the doorway and looked out across the fields as the children slowly approached the schoolhouse one by one. The day was about to begin. The first child usually arrived while the morning still carried traces of frost upon the ground. A small figure moving carefully along the road. Boots dark with mud or dust depending on the season. A scarf wrapped tightly beneath the chin during winter months. Sometimes a knitted cap pulled low over the ears. Sometimes hands tucked deep into coat pockets to escape the cold. The child opened the schoolhouse door quietly at first. Then colder air swept briefly through the room. The teacher looked up from arranging books near the desk and offered a calm greeting. In many rural communities during the 1800s, children were expected to show respect toward teachers from the moment they entered the building. Boys often removed their hats immediately. Girls lowered their voices. Younger children stood awkwardly beside the doorway for a moment before choosing their seats. Some whispered good morning so softly they could barely be heard. Others entered with noisy energy already bubbling inside them despite the early hour. The teacher learned each personality slowly over time. The quiet children. The restless ones. The careful students who erased every mistake until holes appeared in their paper. The boys who stared longingly through the windows toward fields waiting for spring planting. The girls who carried younger brothers to school because no one else remained home to watch them. One by one, the students arrived. The room slowly filled with life. Wet boots stomped lightly near the entrance. Chairs scraped across wooden floors. Lunch pails rested beneath desks. The smell of cold wind mixed with smoke from the stove and damp wool coats hanging near the wall. Outside, daylight continued spreading gently across the countryside. The sky turned pale blue. Thin clouds drifted slowly overhead. A horse pulling a wagon passed somewhere far down the road, its wheels creaking faintly across frozen ground. Inside the schoolhouse, the teacher continued preparing for lessons while the children settled into their places. There was no perfect order in a one-room schoolhouse. How could there be? Children of many different ages shared the same space together every day. Tiny beginners still learning the alphabet sat beside older students practicing geography, arithmetic, or penmanship. Some children attended only part of the year because farms needed extra hands during planting and harvest seasons. Others came regularly whenever weather allowed. The teacher had to guide all of them at once. It required patience more than anything else. Patience and steady calm. The youngest students often sat near the front where the teacher could help them easily. Their small boots rarely reached the floor beneath the desks. Some still struggled to hold chalk properly between stiff little fingers. Older boys sometimes sat farther back, especially during winter when they preferred leaning their chairs near the stove's warmth. Teenage students were not unusual in rural schools during those years. Education did not move quickly for many families. Farm work, sickness, long travel distances, and limited resources interrupted learning constantly. A 17-year-old might still attend lessons beside much younger children. No one found this strange. It was simply part of life. The teacher rang a small bell or called the room gently to order. Gradually the whispers faded. The shuffling quieted. Morning lessons began. Often the day opened with reading or recitation. Education during the early 1800s relied heavily upon repetition spoken aloud. Children learned by hearing words again and again until the sounds settled firmly into memory. The teacher called students forward one at a time. A young girl stood beside her desk clutching a worn reader carefully in both hands. Her cheeks remained pink from the cold walk to school. She began reading slowly, sounding out difficult words while the teacher listened patiently nearby. Sometimes the room became completely still during these moments. Only the child's nervous voice. Only the crackling stove. Only wind brushing softly against the outside walls. If mistakes came, the teacher corrected them gently. Then another student stood. And another. The rhythm continued steadily through the morning. Reading. Spelling. Recitation. Arithmetic. Simple lessons repeated carefully until understanding slowly formed. Older students often worked independently while younger children received instruction nearby. A boy solving arithmetic problems on his slate might sit only a few feet away from small children practicing letters aloud together. The room carried many sounds at once. Slate pencils scratching. Pages turning. Quiet murmuring. Occasional coughing during cold weather. The steady breathing of the stove. And always the teacher's voice moving calmly from one lesson to another. In modern times people often imagine old schoolhouses as perfectly silent places where every child sat motionless all day long. But real classrooms rarely behaved so neatly. Children remained children in every century. A boy whispered jokes when the teacher turned away. A younger child dropped chalk onto the floor. Someone giggled suddenly during spelling recitation. A chair tipped backward with a loud crack against the floorboards. The teacher handled these moments with practiced calm. Discipline in the 1800s could be strict by modern standards, especially in certain schools. Some teachers carried switches or rulers. Some believed strongly in harsh punishment. but many teachers preferred quieter methods whenever possible. A firm voice. A stern glance. Extra lessons after school. Standing silently near the teacher's desk for a short time. Every teacher developed different habits. Every schoolhouse carried its own atmosphere. This particular morning passed peacefully. Outside, sunlight now rested softly across the fields beyond the windows. Frost slowly disappeared from fence posts and tree branches. Crows gathered in distant farmlands searching for scraps among harvested fields. The teacher moved through the room checking lessons carefully. A younger boy struggled with handwriting. The letters leaned unevenly across the page like tiny fences falling sideways in the wind. His fingers pressed too hard against the pen. The teacher paused beside him. Not rushing. Not scolding. Only guiding the small hand gently toward steadier movements. Good penmanship mattered greatly during the 1800s. Clear handwriting was seen almost as a sign of character itself. Employers, ministers, merchants, and teachers valued neat, careful writing. Students spent long hours copying letters and sentences repeatedly across slates or paper. Ink stains covered many young fingers. The teacher straightened and crossed toward another desk. An older girl practiced geography from a faded textbook shared with her younger sister. Maps inside such books often looked simple compared to modern ones. Large blank spaces still appeared across Western territories. Rivers curved across pale pages. Cities were fewer. Roads uncertain. The girl traced locations carefully while sunlight touched the edge of her desk. Nearby, two younger children quietly repeated spelling words together under their breath. Window. Morning. Winter. School. Simple words building slowly toward larger understanding. The teacher listened to all of it at once. That was part of the skill. A one-room schoolhouse demanded constant attention divided in many directions. While helping one student, the teacher also watched others nearby. Lessons overlapped continuously. No moment remained fully still. Yet beneath the movement there existed a kind of calm rhythm that returned day after day. Children studying. Wind outside. Smoke rising from the stove. Pages turning slowly. Morning stretching gently onward. As the hours passed, the warmth from the stove finally spread farther through the room. Coats loosened slightly. Mittens dried beside the fire. Melted snow dripped quietly from boots near the entrance. The air smelled faintly of smoke, chalk dust, damp wool, and old wood. It became the familiar smell of winter learning. Around mid-morning, younger children sometimes grew restless. Tiny feet swung beneath desks. Attention wandered toward the windows. The teacher understood this well. Many children in rural communities were accustomed to outdoor work and movement from a very young age. Sitting still for long periods did not come naturally. So short breaks appeared throughout the day. Students stretched. Stepped outdoors briefly. Fetched water. Carried additional wood inside. These small tasks helped keep the school running. In some communities, older boys were expected to arrive early enough to prepare firewood or sweep paths after snowstorms. Girls might help tidy the classroom or clean slates for younger children. Everyone contributed in some small way. The schoolhouse belonged to the whole community. Parents helped build it. Farmers repaired the roof when storms caused damage. Neighbors donated wood for winter heat. And the teacher stood quietly at the center of it all, trying to hold order together from sunrise until afternoon. Near the back of the room, one small child had begun to grow sleepy. His head lowered little by little above an open reader. The teacher noticed immediately. Perhaps the child had risen before daylight for chores. Perhaps a sick baby kept the household awake through the night. Farm families worked hard, and children shared many responsibilities. The teacher walked quietly toward the desk. A gentle tap upon the wood. The boy blinked awake and straightened quickly while nearby students tried not to smile. The lesson continued. Outside, clouds drifted slowly across the pale winter sky. A thin breeze rattled bare tree branches beside the schoolhouse. And inside the little room, beneath the soft crackling warmth of the stove, the long peaceful morning carried on. By late morning, the schoolhouse had settled fully into the rhythm of the day. The early stiffness and sleepiness had faded from the children. Even the youngest students now sat more comfortably at their desks, their cheeks warm from the stove and their voices steadier during lessons. Sunlight entered through the tall narrow windows in pale strips, stretching slowly across the wooden floorboards as the hours passed. Dust floated softly through the light. The teacher noticed these quiet details without thinking very much about them anymore. After enough seasons inside a one-room schoolhouse, certain sights became part of daily life. Chalk dust drifting through sunlight. Ink drying slowly on rough paper. Snow melting from boots near the doorway. Rainwater sliding quietly down old window glass. The sounds became familiar too. The low murmur of students studying aloud. The occasional creak of wooden desks. Wind moving outside the walls. And always the stove. The steady crackling stove at the center of the room felt almost alive during winter months. Children sitting nearest the fire sometimes grew drowsy from the warmth, while those near the windows still kept scarves wrapped around their shoulders. The teacher crossed the room carefully, carrying a small stack of slates beneath one arm. Slates were used constantly in rural schools during the 1800s because paper cost money, and many families had very little to spare. Children practiced arithmetic, spelling, and handwriting on flat dartboards using slate pencils that scratched softly with every movement. Mistakes could simply be wiped away. Again and again. Lesson after lesson. The teacher paused beside an older student struggling through a long division problem. The boy's brow remained tight with concentration. Large rough hands rested awkwardly against the small slate. He was older than many students in the room, perhaps 16 or 17, but his attendance at school had been interrupted many times by farm work. Planting seasons. Harvest seasons. Long illnesses. Difficult winters. Life often pulled children away from education in those years. The teacher knelt beside the desk and explained the problem once more in a calm, low voice. Numbers were not easy for every student. Some learned quickly through repetition. Others needed patience and time. The teacher understood this well. Teaching in the early 19th century required endurance more than brilliance. There were no large collections of supplies. No glowing lamps overhead. No rows of colorful books. Often there was only one teacher standing before many ages and abilities at once. Yet learning still happened there. Slowly. Quietly. Like water shaping stone over many years. Near the front of the room, younger children practiced reading together. Their voices rose and fell unevenly as they sounded out words from a shared reader. Morning. Winter. River. Bread. Simple words connected gently into sentences. Some children stumbled over difficult sounds while others waited impatiently for their turn. A little girl traced letters carefully with one finger while whispering the words beneath her breath. The teacher listened while moving between desks. Attention had to stretch in many directions at once. A younger child needing help with spelling. An older student asking about geography. Another quietly raising a hand to request more firewood for the stove. There was always something needing attention. And still the teacher remained calm. Outside, the countryside rested beneath the pale stillness of late morning. Smoke rose from distant farmhouses beyond the trees. A horse pulling a wagon moved slowly along the far road, almost silent beneath the drifting wind. Crows circled over empty fields. Everything beyond the schoolhouse seemed unhurried. The world moved more slowly in those years. Travel took time. Letters took time. News traveled slowly from town to town. Even learning itself unfolded at a gentler pace. The teacher returned to the front of the room where a worn blackboard waited beneath fading chalk marks from earlier lessons. The blackboard was one of the most important tools inside the schoolhouse. Simple. Dark. Dust-covered. The teacher picked up a piece of chalk and began writing arithmetic problems carefully across the surface while older students copied them onto slates below. The scratching sound of slate pencils soon filled the room again. Back and forth. Line after line. Some children pressed too hard and broke their slate pencils. Others wrote so lightly their numbers nearly disappeared. The teacher corrected mistakes quietly while passing between rows. There was no clock hanging loudly on the wall in many early schools, but the teacher usually knew the hour by habit and sunlight. The angle of light through the windows. The feeling of the day moving onward. By now stomachs were beginning to grow hungry. Lunch would come soon enough. But first the lessons continued. A history recitation began near midday. History in early American schools often focused heavily upon memory and spoken recitation. Students repeated names, events, and passages aloud until they could speak them clearly without looking down at the page. The teacher called upon a young boy near the back. He stood awkwardly beside his desk and began speaking in a nervous voice while twisting his cap between rough fingers. Several younger children listened with wide serious eyes. One little boy had already forgotten part of the lesson and stared hopefully toward classmates for help. The teacher noticed but said nothing. Embarrassment was rarely useful. Instead, the teacher gently repeated the missing line and allowed the child to continue. Relief softened the boy's face immediately. These tiny moments mattered more than people sometimes realized. A patient teacher could change the entire feeling of a classroom. Some students feared school deeply, especially if previous teachers had ruled through harsh punishment. Others loved the warmth and structure of the schoolhouse compared to difficult conditions at home. The teacher carried responsibility not only for lessons, but also for the atmosphere inside the room itself. Too much harshness could fill children with dread. Too little order could turn the schoolhouse into chaos. Balance mattered. Outside the windows, clouds had slowly gathered overhead. The sunlight dimmed. A faint tapping sound soon touched the roof. Rain. Very light at first. The children noticed immediately, as children always do. A few glanced toward the windows while continuing lessons. The teacher allowed the moment to pass quietly. Rainfall changed the feeling of a school day in subtle ways. The room became dimmer. The smell of damp earth drifted faintly through cracks near the doorway. The stove's warmth felt even more comforting against the cold gray weather outside. The rain continued steadily. Soft. Gentle. Almost soothing. Several younger children now looked sleepy again beneath the steady sound falling overhead. The teacher lowered their voice slightly during the next reading lesson, speaking in the calm measured rhythm that experienced teachers often developed over time. Not hurried. Not sharp. Just steady. A comforting voice could settle an entire room. The children opened readers once more. Pages rustled softly. One by one, students stood and read aloud while rain tapped patiently against the roof above them. The teacher listened carefully to each voice. Some children read too quickly from nervousness. Others moved painfully slow through every word. The teacher adjusted to each child with quiet patience. Outside, the muddy road beyond the schoolhouse darkened beneath the rain. Bare tree branches swayed gently in the wind. Somewhere distant, thunder rolled so faintly it almost sounded like wagon wheels far away. Inside, the schoolhouse remained warm and dim. A peaceful little world of chalk dust, firelight, and soft voices surrounded by gray weather. At last, near the middle of the day, the teacher closed the reader gently. The children immediately sensed what was coming next. Lunchtime. A small wave of movement passed through the room. Books closed. Slates stacked carefully. Whispers returned. The teacher smiled faintly while adding another piece of wood to the stove. The long morning lessons had finally come to an end. The feeling inside the schoolhouse changed almost immediately once the lessons paused for midday. Children who had spent the morning sitting carefully now relaxed all at once. Quiet whispers became lively conversation. Boots scraped against the floorboards. Lunch pails opened with soft metallic clicks. The room filled with the smell of simple food carried from nearby farms and homes. Fresh bread wrapped in cloth. Cold potatoes. Cornbread. Slices of apple saved from autumn storage. Cheese. Boiled eggs. Sometimes smoked meat if a family could spare it. The meals were modest, but after a long morning in the cold air, even plain food felt comforting. Rain still tapped gently against the roof overhead. Several children remained indoors beside the stove rather than stepping outside into the wet weather. They gathered in little clusters near desks while eating slowly and talking in low voices. The younger children often spoke the most. Their conversations wandered from farm animals to weather to stories heard at home the night before. One little girl carefully showed another child a ribbon sewn onto her bonnet by an older sister. Near the back of the room, older boys discussed horses, planting seasons, and river conditions with serious expressions that made them seem older than they truly were. Life in rural America often pushed children toward adulthood early. Many students already carried daily responsibilities beyond school. Milking cows before sunrise. Hauling water. Gathering wood. Helping younger siblings dress and eat. Repairing fences. Feeding chickens. The teacher understood this very well. Most teachers came from similar backgrounds themselves. The teacher remained near the desk during lunch, quietly organizing papers and reviewing the afternoon lessons ahead. There were always small tasks waiting to be finished. Pens needed cleaning. Copybooks needed checking. Arithmetic exercises needed arranging for different age groups. A teacher in a one-room schoolhouse rarely rested fully during the school day. Still, these midday moments carried a certain peace. The room glowed softly beneath gray daylight. Rainwater slid down the windows. The stove crackled steadily at the center of everything. And for a short while, lessons loosened their hold over the children. One younger boy wandered near the stove holding a biscuit carefully in both hands. He stared into the fire with sleepy fascination while chewing slowly. Another child sat near the windows watching raindrops race each other down the glass. The teacher noticed all these tiny quiet scenes while pretending not to watch too closely. A schoolhouse became almost like a second home during long winters. Children revealed themselves there in small ordinary ways. Who shared food willingly? Who remained shy and silent? Who stared out windows dreaming of distant places? Who worked carefully even without praise? The teacher learned far more than spelling and arithmetic about the students over time. Outside, the rain grew slightly heavier. The sound upon the roof deepened into a steady soothing rhythm. Some children smiled softly at it. Others looked worried about the long walk home later in the day. Weather shaped daily life deeply during the 1800s. Heavy storms could flood roads, delay travel, damage crops, or isolate farms for days at a time. People paid close attention to the sky. Even children did. One older girl carefully folded scraps of cloth back around her lunch before placing everything neatly inside a tin pail. Her movements were slow and practiced. Nothing could be wasted. Not food. Not fabric. Not time. Families worked too hard for carelessness. The teacher walked quietly toward the windows and looked outside for a moment. Gray clouds rested low across the countryside. The nearby trees swayed gently in the damp wind. Beyond them, open farmland stretched outward beneath the rain, soft and blurred in the distance. The world seemed quieter during rainfall. Almost sleepy. The teacher often appreciated rainy school days. Children tended to settle more easily during lessons afterward. The steady sound outside softened the room somehow, wrapping the schoolhouse in calm stillness. A small disagreement suddenly broke out near one of the desks. Two boys arguing softly over a slate pencil. Nothing serious. Just tiredness and impatience after a long morning. The teacher crossed the room without hurry. There was no need for loud anger. The problem was settled with a few calm words and a reminder to share supplies carefully. The boys lowered their eyes and nodded. Moments later, the tension had already faded away. Small conflicts happened often in crowded schoolhouses. Children spent long hours together in a single room with few possessions and little personal space. Learning how to live beside one another became part of education itself. The teacher returned to the desk once more. Outside, the rain finally began easing into a soft mist. A pale brightness slowly returned behind the clouds. One by one, students finished eating. Lunch cloths folded neatly. Tin pails closed. Crumbs brushed gently from desks. Several older boys carried additional wood inside for the afternoon fire while younger children lined up near a water bucket waiting patiently for a drink. The teacher watched carefully to ensure everyone behaved properly around the stove and water supply. Illness spread easily during the 19th century, especially in winter. Cleanliness mattered, though resources were limited. Many schoolhouses lacked even the simplest comforts. No running water. No indoor plumbing. No electric lighting. Only what the community could build and maintain with its own hands. Yet despite these hardships, the little schoolhouse remained important. For many children, it offered the only formal education they would ever receive. Some students attended only a few winters before leaving permanently to work full-time on farms or in workshops. Others continued longer and carried their education into teaching, business, ministry, or town life elsewhere. The teacher sometimes wondered quietly about their futures. Which children would remain nearby their entire lives? Which would travel west someday? Which would become parents bringing their own children to this very schoolhouse years later? These thoughts came and went softly during quiet moments. Soon the midday break neared its end. The room slowly settled once again. Children returned to desks with lingering sighs and whispers. Younger students rubbed sleepy eyes. A few older boys stretched stiff shoulders after sitting too long. The teacher added another log to the stove. Flames brightened briefly behind the iron door. Warmth spread outward again. Afternoon lessons were about to begin. Outside, the rain had almost completely stopped now. Drops still clung to tree branches and fence rails. The muddy road beyond the schoolhouse glistened beneath weak pale sunlight returning through the clouds. A soft gray calm rested across the countryside. Inside, the teacher stood near the front of the room while the final whispers faded away. Books reopened. Slates returned to waiting hands. The long quiet afternoon slowly began. Afternoon light entered the schoolhouse differently from the light of morning. By now the pale brightness had softened into something calmer and lower, especially during the colder months when the sun never climbed very high above the fields. The windows glowed gently beneath the fading gray sky outside, and the warmth of the stove seemed deeper and heavier after the midday meal. The children settled back into their lessons with slower movements. Even the most energetic students often became quieter during afternoon hours. Full stomachs. Warm air near the stove. The steady sound of rainwater still dripping from the roof outside. All of it wrapped the room in a sleepy stillness. The teacher understood this feeling well and adjusted the rhythm of the day accordingly. More difficult lessons usually came during the morning while minds remained fresh and alert. Afternoons often carried softer work. Reading. Copying. Penmanship. Geography recitations. Calm lessons that allowed the day to move gently toward evening. The teacher picked up a worn reader from the desk near the front of the room. The cover had faded long ago from years of use. Corners were bent. Several pages had been repaired carefully with thread and scraps of paper. Books rarely remained new for very long in rural schools. Each one passed through many hands over many years. The teacher opened the reader slowly. Several younger students immediately straightened in their seats. Story readings were among the quieter pleasures of the school day, especially when weather kept everyone indoors. The teacher began reading aloud in a steady, gentle voice. Not too fast. Not too dramatic. Simply clear and calm. The children listened while rainwater continued dripping softly outside the windows. Some followed along in shared books resting across their desks. Others simply stared toward the front of the room, allowing the words to carry them quietly away from muddy roads and winter chores for a little while. Reading aloud mattered greatly during the 1800s. Books were less common than they would later become, especially in isolated rural communities. Many families owned only a Bible and perhaps a few additional volumes if they were fortunate. The sound of someone reading clearly and patiently could transform an ordinary afternoon into something memorable. The teacher knew this. So the voice remained soft and measured, filling the room without strain. A younger child near the stove leaned heavily against one arm while listening. Another traced invisible shapes across the desk with tired fingers. Outside, the clouds slowly drifted apart. Thin sunlight touched the wet fields beyond the schoolhouse. Steam rose faintly from muddy roads where rainwater warmed beneath the returning light. The teacher closed the book gently after several pages. For a few quiet moments, nobody moved. The room rested in peaceful silence broken only by the crackling stove and the distant call of a crow outside somewhere across the fields. Then the teacher spoke again. Penmanship practice. Several children sighed softly. A few older students smiled faintly because they enjoyed careful writing lessons far more than arithmetic. The teacher walked between the rows distributing copybooks and checking ink bottles one at a time. Ink required caution in a crowded schoolhouse. A spilled bottle could ruin precious paper, stain clothing, and create a mess difficult to clean from rough wooden desks. The children prepared carefully. Pens dipped slowly into ink. Copybooks opened. The teacher wrote a sentence neatly upon the blackboard at the front of the room. Each letter formed with steady, deliberate strokes. Good handwriting reflected discipline and patience during the 19th century. Employers judged it. Teachers corrected it constantly. Parents often took pride in children who learned to write beautifully. The students began copying the sentence in silence. Scratch. 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 Dozens of pen tips moving across paper together. The sound became soft and almost soothing after a while. The teacher wandered quietly among the desks. One girl formed beautiful letters already, smooth and graceful despite her young age. Another student pressed too hard against the paper, causing small tears to appear beside the ink lines. The teacher paused beside him gently. Lighter, came the quiet reminder. The boy nodded and tried again. Outside, a breeze moved through the wet branches surrounding the schoolhouse. Water droplets fell softly from the trees. The air beyond the windows looked cold and silver beneath the fading afternoon sky. Winter days felt short. Darkness arrived quickly. Everyone inside the schoolhouse could feel it slowly approaching. The teacher glanced toward the windows briefly before returning attention to the room. Soon the younger students would grow restless again. Afternoons often became difficult during long winters. Children tired easily after waking before dawn and walking miles through cold weather. Concentration drifted. The teacher understood when to allow small breaks. An older boy was sent outside for additional firewood. Another student refilled the water bucket from the nearby pump despite the cold mud surrounding it. Several younger children stretched stiff legs beside their desks while waiting for the next lesson. The teacher believed movement helped restore attention better than scolding tired children endlessly. Outside the schoolhouse, the countryside remained peaceful and empty. Most adults were still busy with work across nearby farms. Smoke rose steadily from chimneys. Horses pulled wagons slowly along distant roads carrying feed, supplies, or firewood before darkness settled fully over the land. Life continued quietly beyond the classroom walls. Inside, geography lessons began. A large worn map was carefully unrolled near the front of the room. Its edges curled stubbornly after years of storage. Rivers crossed the faded surface like dark twisting veins. Mountains rose in uneven shaded lines. Several younger children stared at the map with fascination. Maps carried a kind of magic in isolated rural communities. They hinted at enormous places beyond the familiar fields and forests surrounding daily life. The teacher pointed slowly toward different regions while older students followed carefully. Many children in that little room would never travel far from the places where they had been born. Yet through maps and books they learned the names of distant rivers, cities, and oceans. The teacher spoke quietly about faraway places while afternoon light continued fading around them. One younger boy imagined ships crossing wide waters he would likely never see. Another pictured enormous cities filled with strangers and noise. The teacher could almost sense these wandering thoughts drifting through the room. Still, the lesson remained calm and orderly. Nothing rushed. The school day moved slowly onward like a river flowing through winter fields. At the back of the room, one child had begun blinking heavily with sleep again. His chin lowered little by little toward his chest. The teacher noticed. So did several nearby students, trying very hard not to laugh. But before anyone could speak, the boy jerked awake suddenly and straightened himself with wide embarrassed eyes. A few quiet giggles escaped. The teacher smiled faintly but said nothing harsh. The room settled again almost immediately. These small human moments softened long school days. Outside, the weak afternoon sunlight had nearly disappeared now behind gathering clouds in the west. The windows darkened slowly. The teacher knew evening was not far away. But there were still lessons left before the children could begin their long walks home through the cold countryside. As the afternoon continued, the schoolhouse grew quieter in a different way than before. It was not the alert quietness of morning lessons when every mind still felt fresh and sharp. This was a softer silence. A tired silence. The kind that settled slowly over children after many hours of reading, writing, reciting, and sitting still beside the warm stove. The teacher could feel it in the room. The younger students shifted more often in their seats now. Some rested tired cheeks against their hands while listening. Older boys stretched stiff shoulders and glanced occasionally toward the windows where the fading daylight reminded them of chores still waiting at home. Winter afternoons always seemed shorter than expected. The sun drifted downward quickly beyond the fields, and darkness approached long before anyone felt ready for it. The teacher moved calmly between the desks while students continued their copy work. A small girl near the front struggled carefully with a sentence written across her page. Her tongue pressed slightly against her lip with concentration while she shaped each letter one slow stroke at a time. The teacher paused beside her. Very gently, one finger pointed toward a crooked word leaning too far across the line. The child erased it carefully and began again without complaint. Patience was woven into almost every part of education during the 19th century. Lessons repeated. Mistakes corrected. Lines rewritten. Words spoken again and again until they finally settled into memory. There was rarely hurry inside the one-room schoolhouse. Only steady effort. Outside, the clouds thickened once more across the sky. The earlier rain had stopped completely, but the world beyond the windows remained gray and damp. Bare tree branches moved quietly in the cold wind. Mud along the road reflected weak fading light like dull silver. A lone wagon rolled slowly past in the distance. The children nearest the windows noticed first. Several heads turned slightly. The teacher allowed the moment. Distraction drifted naturally through long afternoons, especially in small rural schools where almost anything passing outside became interesting. The wagon disappeared beyond the trees after a few moments, and attention slowly returned to lessons again. The teacher picked up the small handbell resting near the desk. Its soft ringing sound carried gently through the room. Copybooks closed. Pens wiped carefully clean. Another lesson had ended. Now came spelling. Spelling lessons in the 1800s were serious work. Correct spelling mattered deeply in schools and communities where education itself was viewed as something valuable and hard-earned. The teacher opened a worn spelling book while students prepared themselves. Some children sat straighter immediately, eager to perform well. Others looked nervous. One by one, students stood beside their desks while the teacher called out words in a calm, steady voice. Harvest. Winter. Lantern. River. The students repeated the words carefully before spelling them aloud. Sometimes letters came confidently. Sometimes uncertainty crept into trembling voices. The teacher listened patiently to each attempt. A wrong answer did not bring shouting or humiliation here. Only correction. Only another chance to try again later. That quiet kindness changed the feeling of the room. Even children who struggled continued trying because fear did not hang heavily over every mistake. Outside, evening slowly approached the countryside. Smoke thickened above distant chimneys as families prepared supper fires. Farm animals were gathered into barns before nightfall. Crows disappeared into dark trees along the fields. The schoolhouse windows now reflected faint shadows from inside the room. The stove glowed softly at its center. Warm orange light flickered against iron and wood. The teacher noticed several younger children rubbing tired eyes again. It had been a long day already. Many had awakened before sunrise. Many still faced long walks home through muddy roads and cold wind. The teacher decided upon a short pause before the final lessons. Children stood carefully beside desks, stretching cramped legs and stiff backs. Quiet conversation returned for a few moments. One older boy carried more wood inside while another adjusted the stove door with practiced hands. A younger child carefully sharpened slate pencils near the teacher's desk under close supervision. Small responsibilities filled the daily life of the schoolhouse. Everyone helped where they could. The teacher stepped briefly toward the doorway and opened it. Cold evening air drifted inside immediately. Fresh and damp. The teacher breathed deeply for a moment while looking out across the quiet countryside. The fields beyond the schoolhouse had turned dark beneath the cloudy sky. Thin fog was beginning to gather low over parts of the land where rainwater rested in shallow ground. Somewhere far away, a dog barked. Then silence again. The teacher often treasured these brief pauses between lessons. Teaching required constant attention from morning until evening. A calm moment standing alone beside the doorway could feel deeply peaceful after hours spent guiding many young minds at once. Inside the room, children waited quietly now for lessons to continue. The teacher closed the door against the cold and returned once more to the front of the classroom. Reading lessons began again. This time older students took turns reading longer passages aloud while younger children listened. The fading daylight made the room feel smaller and warmer than before. Shadows gathered gently along the corners of the ceiling. The stove's soft glow flickered against rows of tired faces. One older girl stood near the front holding her reader carefully in both hands. Her voice carried calmly through the room. Steady. Clear. Certain. The teacher listened with quiet pride. Not every student learned quickly, but moments like these reminded teachers why the difficult work mattered. A child who once struggled through simple words could someday stand confidently before the entire room reading with ease. Progress came slowly. Yet it came. The girl finished reading and sat down carefully. Another student rose. Then another. The rhythm continued while darkness deepened gradually outside the windows. At last, the teacher lit a lamp near the desk. Its small flame glowed warmly against the growing dusk. Several younger children watched the light with sleepy fascination. Oil lamps and candles shaped evening life during the 19th century. Once daylight faded, every source of light became precious. Families conserved candles carefully. Lamps were cleaned and trimmed with attention. Darkness arrived fully in those years. True darkness. Not softened by distant electric lights or glowing streets. The teacher knew many students still had long roads ahead before reaching home. So the final lessons moved gently toward conclusion. Arithmetic problems were reviewed one last time. Reading assignments repeated quietly. Tomorrow's work explained carefully. The children listened while gathering books and slates together. Outside, the first real signs of evening had settled over the countryside. The long school day was nearly over. The final hour of the school day often felt the quietest. Not because the children had suddenly become perfectly still, but because tiredness settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Voices softened. Movements slowed. Even the youngest students seemed calmer beneath the dim evening light. The teacher stood near the front of the schoolhouse while the last arithmetic lesson came to an end. Several older students copied problems carefully from the blackboard one final time before tomorrow. Younger children stacked their slates neatly beside worn readers and folded small hands together while waiting for dismissal. Outside the windows, dusk spread slowly across the countryside. The sky had turned the color of faded smoke. Bare trees stood dark against the horizon. Thin fog drifted low across the muddy fields where rainwater still rested from the afternoon storm. The teacher glanced toward the windows often now. Not from distraction. From responsibility. Many children still faced long walks home along narrow country roads, and winter evenings arrived quickly. Parents expected children home before darkness settled too deeply over the fields and woods. The teacher understood this well. The room itself had grown warmer through the long day. The stove glowed steadily beneath its iron door. Damp coats hanging nearby had nearly dried completely. The smell of smoke and old wood filled the schoolhouse in a comforting way that many children would later remember throughout their lives. For some students, the little schoolhouse felt safer and calmer than their homes. Not because home lacked love, but because life in rural America could be difficult. Farms demanded constant labor. Younger children cried through the night. Illness visited families often. Winters were long. Money was scarce. Inside the schoolhouse there was structure, warmth, routine. The steady voice of the teacher guiding one lesson gently into another. Many children quietly treasured that feeling even if they never spoke about it aloud. The teacher called upon one final student to read. A boy around 13 stood slowly beside his desk holding a worn reader with rough reddened hands. His boots were still muddy from the morning walk. A loose thread hung from one coat sleeve where careful mending had begun to unravel again. He cleared his throat nervously before beginning. At first the words came slowly. Then more steadily. The teacher listened patiently while the room remained almost completely silent around them. Even restless children usually grew calmer near the end of the day. Darkness outside the windows created a natural quietness inside the schoolhouse. The warm stove, the dim lamplight, and the steady rhythm of reading all softened the room. The boy finished at last and sat down carefully. The teacher nodded with calm approval. No loud praise. No dramatic applause. Only quiet recognition. In many 19th century schools, learning itself was treated seriously and simply. Pride existed, but it was often expressed through small gestures rather than large celebrations. The teacher turned toward the blackboard and reviewed tomorrow's assignments once more. Several older students copied them carefully onto scraps of paper. Others simply memorized the instructions. Paper could not always be wasted. Outside, the wind had become gentler now. The rain clouds slowly drifted farther east, leaving narrow openings in the evening sky where pale fading light still lingered beneath the horizon. One younger child yawned widely without covering his mouth. A few nearby students smiled sleepily. The teacher pretended not to notice. There would be enough scolding in life without correcting every tiny moment of childish tiredness. At last the teacher closed the lesson book resting upon the desk. The familiar sound immediately changed the feeling inside the room. Dismissal had come. Children straightened quickly despite their exhaustion. Slates disappeared into satchels. Scarves and coats were gathered from hooks near the door. Lunch pails clattered softly while being collected from beneath desks. The teacher reminded everyone to walk carefully along the muddy roads after the rain. Several students nodded politely. Others were already too eager to leave and barely heard the words at all. Then the school day ended. The door opened. Cold evening air swept briefly through the room once more. Children stepped outside into the fading light one by one, their voices suddenly brighter after long hours indoors. Boots splashed softly through wet ground near the entrance. Small groups formed quickly along the road. Brothers walking beside sisters. Neighbors heading toward distant farms together. Older children carrying lanterns for the journey home after dark. The teacher stood quietly near the doorway watching them leave. This too was part of the daily routine. Watching until the last child disappeared safely down the road. The countryside slowly swallowed the sounds of departing voices. One group vanished behind the trees. Another crossed the far hill beside a fence line. Soon only silence remained again. The schoolhouse felt very different once empty. Still warm. Still carrying faint echoes of the day. But suddenly much larger and lonelier without the presence of children. The teacher closed the door gently against the evening cold and turned back toward the quiet room. Work still remained. There was always work remaining. Desks needed straightening. Books needed gathering. The stove needed tending before night. The teacher moved slowly between the rows in the fading light. A forgotten slate pencil rested beneath one desk. A child's scarf had been left hanging near the wall. The teacher folded it carefully, already knowing whose mother would ask about it tomorrow morning. Outside, darkness deepened steadily across the land. The last pale light disappeared from the windows. The teacher lit another lamp. Its soft glow spread across the empty schoolhouse, illuminating chalk dust floating quietly through the warm air. The room seemed peaceful now in a completely different way. Not lively. Not busy. Only still. The teacher erased the blackboard slowly while thinking through the long day that had just passed. Some lessons had gone well. Some children still needed extra help. One boy continued struggling with reading. Another showed real improvement in arithmetic. A younger child seemed quieter than usual and might be getting sick. Teachers carried these thoughts home with them each evening. The work rarely ended completely when the students left. Outside, the night wind moved gently through the trees surrounding the schoolhouse. Somewhere distant, a wagon rolled slowly along the dark road toward home. The teacher added one final piece of wood to the stove and gathered the remaining books together. Soon it would be time to leave the schoolhouse behind until another cold morning arrived. And another long day quietly began again. The teacher lingered inside the empty schoolhouse for a few moments longer before preparing to leave. The quiet after dismissal always felt deep. Almost surprising. Only a short while earlier the room had been full of voices, footsteps, lessons, questions, coughing, laughter, and the endless small sounds of children moving through the long day together. Now there was only the soft crackling of the stove. The faint hiss of cooling rainwater dripping outside. And the gentle creak of old wood settling into evening silence. The teacher moved slowly between the rows of desks, straightening chairs, and gathering forgotten items left behind by tired students rushing home before darkness. A mitten. A ribbon. One small reader resting open where a younger child had accidentally abandoned it. The teacher picked it up carefully and brushed dust from the worn cover. Books were treated gently in those years because replacing them was not easy. Every reader, every map, every arithmetic book might remain in use for many years inside the same little schoolhouse. The teacher placed the reader neatly upon the desk beside several others waiting there in careful stacks. Outside, the last traces of daylight faded almost completely from the sky. Night arrived quickly in the countryside during winter. Without electric lights, darkness spread across the land in a way difficult to imagine now. Roads disappeared into shadow. Trees became dark shapes against the sky. Farmhouses glowed faintly from candlelight shining through windows far across the fields. The teacher adjusted the lamp flame slightly brighter. Warm yellow light filled the room. Shadows shifted softly along the walls. The blackboard still carried faint chalk marks from the day's lessons despite being mostly erased. A few unfinished numbers remained visible if one looked closely enough. The teacher noticed them and smiled faintly before wiping them away completely. Tomorrow would bring new lessons. New mistakes. New small victories. The routine continued day after day, season after season. That steady repetition shaped the life of a 19th century teacher more than anything else. The same road each morning. The same stove to light. The same voices reading aloud beside the windows. And yet no 2 days were ever entirely alike. Weather changed. Children changed. Families changed. Sometimes new students arrived unexpectedly after moving into the area. Sometimes older ones disappeared from school forever because work at home now required them full-time. The teacher had seen both many times before. A quiet sadness often accompanied those disappearances. Some students showed great promise in reading or writing but could no longer attend regularly once families needed extra labor on farms or in workshops. Life was practical during those years. Education mattered deeply, but survival mattered more. The teacher understood this without bitterness. Still, certain empty desks were noticed. Outside, wind brushed softly against the schoolhouse walls. The teacher carried a small bucket toward the doorway and stepped outside briefly to empty ashes from the stove into a safe patch of wet ground nearby. Cold air wrapped immediately around tired shoulders. The night smelled of rain, smoke, and damp earth. Above the dark fields, clouds had finally begun breaking apart. Thin openings revealed scattered stars slowly appearing across the winter sky. The teacher paused for a moment beside the schoolhouse steps. The countryside looked peaceful now. No children on the roads. No wagon traffic nearby. Only distant farmhouse lights glowing quietly through the darkness. A lantern flickered far away near one barn where evening chores were still being finished. The teacher knew what many students were doing at that very moment. Feeding animals. Carrying water indoors. Helping prepare supper. Rocking younger siblings beside the fire. Life did not stop after school ended. For farm families especially, evenings still carried many responsibilities. The teacher returned inside once more and closed the door firmly against the cold. The room had begun cooling already despite the stove's remaining warmth. Shadows deepened along the corners of the ceiling. The lamp flame flickered gently whenever wind pressed faintly against the walls outside. The teacher sat down at the desk at last. Feet ached from standing most of the day. The throat felt dry from hours of speaking and reading aloud. Hands carried traces of chalk dust and ink. Teaching was tiring work. Not dramatic tiring. Not loud exhausting labor like chopping wood or harvesting fields. But a quieter kind of weariness that settled slowly into the mind and body after guiding many children hour after hour. The teacher opened a small notebook. Attendance records needed updating. Notes about lessons. Lists of supplies running low. Perhaps reminders about students needing extra help. Paperwork existed even in small rural schools, though far simpler than modern records. The teacher wrote carefully beneath the warm lamplight. Pen scratching softly across the page. Outside, the wind faded again into stillness. Every now and then the schoolhouse creaked gently in the cold. The teacher paused during writing and looked around the empty room. There was something strangely comforting about being alone inside the schoolhouse after dark. The desks resting quietly in rows. The stove glowing softly. The faint smell of smoke and old books lingering in the air. A feeling of order after the long busy day. The teacher often reflected during these evening moments. Not grand reflections. Simple thoughts. Wondering whether tomorrow's geography lesson would keep the younger children interested. Wondering if little Clara's cough was becoming worse. Wondering whether enough would remain for the rest of the week if colder weather arrived again. Small ordinary worries. Small ordinary hopes. The life of a rural school teacher rarely appeared in newspapers or history books in great detail. Yet thousands of quiet teachers shaped everyday life across towns and countryside throughout the 19th century. Many communities depended deeply upon them. Parents trusted them with children. Churches respected them. Students remembered them long after lessons ended. Even years later, grown men and women could still recall the voice of a teacher reading aloud beside a winter stove during childhood. The teacher closed the notebook gently. At last the work was finished for the evening. The lamp flame flickered lower now as oil slowly burned away. The schoolhouse had grown colder too. It was time to leave. The teacher gathered books and supplies carefully into a satchel and moved toward the door once more. Before leaving, there was always one final glance around the room. Desks orderly. Fire safe. Windows secured against weather. Everything prepared for another morning. The teacher lowered the lamp flame slightly and stepped outside into the cold, quiet night. The schoolhouse door closed softly behind them. For a moment, the teacher stood alone beneath the dark sky listening to the countryside. Wind in the trees. A distant owl calling somewhere across the fields. The faint rustle of dry grass moving in the cold. Then slowly, beneath the pale light of early stars, the teacher began the journey home. The road home always felt different from the road to school. Morning walks carried preparation and purpose. The day still waited ahead then, quiet and unopened like a book whose pages had not yet been turned. But evening walks carried tiredness. Reflection. The slow unwinding of long hours spent teaching beneath the warmth of the schoolhouse stove. The teacher stepped carefully along the muddy road while night settled fully across the countryside. The lantern hanging from one hand swayed gently with each step, casting soft moving light across puddles, stones, and wet patches of frozen ground. Beyond that small circle of light, darkness stretched quietly across the fields. The countryside at night in the early 1800s could feel enormous. Without electric lamps or glowing towns spread across the horizon, darkness remained deep and complete. Trees disappeared into shadow. Fence lines faded from sight. The sky above often seemed larger because there were so few lights below it. Tonight, clouds drifted slowly apart overhead. More stars appeared between them. Cold, clear air settled across the land after the rain. The teacher pulled a coat tighter against the wind and continued walking. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then fell silent. A barn door creaked. The faint sound of water moving through a nearby creek reached the road whenever the wind shifted. Small sounds carried very far at night. The teacher knew this road so well that many parts no longer required thought. The feet remembered where the deeper ruts lay hidden beneath mud. The hands knew exactly how high to lift the lantern while crossing rough ground. Night after night. Season after season. The same journey repeated itself. There was comfort in that repetition. Life in rural communities often followed familiar patterns shaped by weather, daylight, and work. The teacher rose before dawn, walked to school, guided lessons beside the stove, then returned home beneath evening skies. Tomorrow the routine would begin again. And the day after that. The steady rhythm of such lives could seem quiet from the outside, but inside those routines lived countless small moments of meaning. A child finally reading clearly after weeks of struggle. A peaceful snowfall outside the schoolhouse windows. A room full of students listening carefully during a story. These moments stayed with teachers long after ordinary days faded from memory. The teacher passed a line of bare trees beside the road. Water dripped slowly from branches after the afternoon rain. The lantern light touched wet bark and patches of frost shining faintly along the ground. Winter had a particular smell in the countryside. Cold earth. Wood smoke. Damp leaves beneath snow or rain. The teacher breathed deeply while walking. Ahead, distant farmhouse windows glowed softly through the darkness. Small points of warm light scattered across the land where families gathered indoors for supper and evening chores. The teacher imagined many students already seated near their own fires at home. Boots drying beside hearths. Parents asking softly about the school day. Younger brothers and sisters listening sleepily nearby. Perhaps one child still practicing spelling words before bed. Perhaps another already half asleep in a wooden chair after rising before dawn for chores. Children in farming communities worked hard. Even the youngest often carried responsibilities modern people might consider too heavy for small shoulders. Yet childhood still existed there. Children still laughed during recess. Still whispered during lessons. Still watched snowflakes drift outside classroom windows with wonder in their eyes. The teacher smiled faintly at the thought. A cold breeze moved across the open fields, causing the lantern flame to flicker behind its glass. The teacher lowered one hand around the lantern protectively and continued onward. At last the road curved gently toward the farmhouse where lodging had been arranged for the winter. Many rural teachers boarded with local families rather than maintaining homes of their own. Communities often rotated teachers between households or provided simple rooms in exchange for reduced pay. It was practical. The teacher approached the farmhouse gate slowly. Warm light glowed through the windows. Smoke drifted steadily from the chimney into the cold night sky. The smell of supper still lingered faintly in the air even outside. The teacher climbed the wooden steps and knocked softly before entering. Warmth wrapped around the body almost immediately. The difference between cold night air and fire-heated rooms always felt striking during winter months. Stiff fingers slowly relaxed. Boots thawed. The smell of stew, bread, and wood smoke filled the house. Inside, the farming family continued their quiet evening routine. Children sat near the fire mending clothing or finishing small chores. A mother cleared supper dishes slowly from the table. The farmer rested tired hands beside the stove after long hours outdoors. The teacher greeted them politely. Rural hospitality often remained simple but sincere during those years. Families understood hard work because everyone shared it. A warm meal and a dry place to sleep mattered greatly in country life. The teacher removed wet boots near the doorway and hung a coat close enough to the fire for drying. Conversation stayed gentle and unhurried. Perhaps the farmer asked whether the roads near the schoolhouse remained muddy after the rain. Perhaps a younger child shyly asked about tomorrow's lessons. Perhaps everyone simply sat quietly together listening to the wind outside. Silence did not make people uncomfortable in many 19th century homes. Long days of labor often left families content with calm company rather than endless conversation. The teacher accepted a simple evening meal if one had been saved aside. Stew. Bread. Warm milk or weak tea. Nothing fancy. But after the cold walk home, the warmth felt deeply comforting. The fire crackled steadily while shadows moved softly across the walls. One younger child sitting near the hearth began nodding sleepily beside a pile of unfinished mending. The mother smiled gently and carried the child toward bed. The teacher watched quietly. Family life in rural America often centered around the hearth during evening hours. Firelight provided warmth, light, and a gathering place after dark. People read, repaired tools, sewed clothing, told stories, or simply rested beside the flames. Outside, darkness covered the countryside completely now. The roads emptied. Barns stood silent beneath the stars. Only occasional lantern light moved in distant windows where late chores still continued. The teacher eventually rose from the table and thanked the family softly before retiring for the night. The small bedroom upstairs remained cold despite the fire below. A wash basin stood near the window. A candle flickered gently upon a narrow table beside the bed. The teacher prepared quietly for sleep. Boots placed carefully near the wall. Clothing folded neatly over a chair. Hair brushed slowly beneath candlelight. The body ached pleasantly with tiredness after the long day. Tomorrow morning would come early again. Another fire to light. Another road to walk. Another room full of waiting children. The teacher blew out the candle at last. Darkness settled softly across the room. Outside the window, wind moved gently through the winter trees while somewhere far away an owl called into the quiet countryside. And beneath thick blankets in the stillness of the cold farmhouse night, the teacher slowly drifted toward sleep. Night deepened further after the candle was extinguished, settling into the farmhouse like something soft and familiar. The room grew quiet in a way that felt complete. Not empty. Just still. Outside the window, the winter wind moved gently through bare branches, brushing against the glass with a faint, distant sound. It was not loud enough to disturb sleep, only enough to remind the world that it still existed beyond the warmth of the house. The teacher lay beneath thick blankets, breathing slowly. Tiredness did not arrive all at once. It came in layers. First the heaviness in the shoulders. Then the slow release of tension from the hands. Then the quiet sinking of thoughts that had been holding the day together. The schoolhouse remained in the mind for a while even after leaving it behind. The rows of desks. The small faces listening during reading lessons. The sound of slate pencils scratching softly across dark boards. The crackle of the stove during cold afternoon hours. These images drifted gently through thought like fading echoes. Then they softened. Then they faded further. Until only stillness remained. The farmhouse itself slept in its own way. Downstairs, the fire had burned low to glowing embers. A faint warmth lingered near the hearth where the family had gathered earlier in the evening. Occasionally the wood shifted slightly as it settled, releasing a tiny whisper of sound into the dark. Somewhere in another room, a child turned in sleep. A floorboard creaked once. Then silence again. Life continued even in rest, but quietly, almost invisibly. The teacher's breathing slowed further. The mind no longer followed structured thoughts. Only impressions remained. A stretch of muddy road under lantern light. The soft glow of lamps inside the schoolhouse at dusk. A child reading carefully, word by word, gaining confidence with each sentence. A winter sky turning pale gray in the morning before the day began. Time in those moments felt less like movement and more like a gentle drifting. Outside, the wind eased. Clouds shifted across the sky, revealing more stars. In rural America during the 1800s, night skies were often clearer than they are in later times, especially away from towns. Without widespread artificial light, the stars appeared steady and distant, scattered across darkness like quiet points of memory. The teacher did not look at them now. But they were there. Steady above the sleeping land. Hours passed in the calm way they do when nothing demands attention. No bells. No footsteps. No voices calling for lessons or help or correction. Only rest. Only quiet. Eventually, even the awareness of the room itself softened. The weight of the blankets became less noticeable. The sound of wind outside faded into something barely heard at all. Thought dissolved slowly into sleep. And sleep, in turn, became deeper. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Just a gradual sinking into stillness, as though the night itself was gently carrying everything away from the surface of waking life. Far away, the countryside remained unchanged. Farms rested under frost and starlight. Empty roads curved through dark fields. The schoolhouse stood silent, waiting for morning to return to it again. Inside the farmhouse, warmth remained near the hearth. And upstairs, beneath the steady quiet of winter night, the teacher finally drifted fully into sleep. The day had ended completely now. Not sharply. Not with conclusion. But in the same slow way it had unfolded from the beginning. Like dawn arriving. Like evening fading. Like time itself moving gently forward without rush. And somewhere far beyond the window, the night continued its quiet passage across the land. Morning returned the same way it always did in the countryside of the 1800s. Not suddenly. Not loudly. But slowly, as if the world was remembering how to become visible again. Before the teacher even opened their eyes, there was already a sense of the room changing. The cold softened slightly. The darkness lightened into gray. The farmhouse creaked in its familiar morning rhythm as if waking alongside everyone inside it. Somewhere below, a fire was being rebuilt. Wood placed carefully. A spark caught. Then the quiet beginning of warmth spreading through old brick and iron. The teacher remained still for a moment beneath the blankets, listening. Morning sounds were always simple in rural homes. A kettle shifting near the stove. A soft step across wooden floorboards. The faint rustle of clothing being prepared for the day. Outside, the wind had calmed compared to the night before. The storm that once passed through the fields had left the world damp and refreshed, holding a clean coldness that belonged only to early morning hours. Eventually, the teacher rose. Slow movements. Familiar routine. Everything done quietly so as not to disturb the household still half wrapped in sleep. The room looked slightly different in morning light. The candle from the night before had burned down completely. The small chair beside the bed waited in silence. The window showed a pale sky gradually filling with light. The teacher dressed carefully. Wool garments warmed by the house's early fire downstairs. Boots still slightly cold from the night air. A coat heavy enough to carry through winter wind. Every piece of clothing had a purpose. Nothing was unnecessary. Downstairs, the farmhouse was already gently alive. The family moved through morning tasks with practiced rhythm. Bread warmed near the stove. Water was drawn from a bucket. A child sat quietly near the hearth still half asleep, watching embers glow. The teacher was greeted with simple nods and soft morning words. No rush. No excess conversation. Only the steady acknowledgement of another day beginning. A small portion of breakfast was shared again. Bread. Warm drink. Something simple and filling enough to carry strength through long hours ahead. Outside, light had fully returned now. The fields were pale and still, covered with a thin layer of frost that shimmered faintly under the rising sun. The road leading toward the schoolhouse stretched ahead in its familiar path, quiet and waiting. The teacher prepared to leave. A coat buttoned slowly. A satchel gathered. A final moment by the doorway before stepping into the cold air. The morning greeted everything with clarity. The same trees. The same fences. The same distant barns. But each morning still felt slightly new, as if the world had been reset during the night. The teacher began walking. Boots pressed into the frozen ground with steady rhythm. Breath appeared briefly in the air before fading. The lantern from the night before was no longer needed, daylight now handled everything. As the schoolhouse came into view again in the distance, it looked unchanged. Small. Simple. Patiently waiting. Smoke was already beginning to rise from its chimney, signaling that someone, perhaps the teacher, perhaps an older student assigned early duty, had already begun preparing the fire. The teacher approached slowly. The day would begin again soon. And once more, the quiet cycle of lessons, voices, warmth, and winter light would unfold inside the small wooden room beside the fields. The schoolhouse stood in the early morning like it always did, unchanged by the night that had passed. A simple wooden structure resting beside open fields, its paint weathered by years of wind, rain, and winter frost. The chimney released a thin steady line of smoke that drifted upward into the pale sky, curling slowly before disappearing into the cold air above. The teacher paused for a moment before entering. There was always a brief stillness at this time of day. The land was quiet. The road empty. Even the wind seemed to move more gently in early morning hours, as if the world had not yet fully committed to the noise of daytime life. Then the teacher opened the door. Warm air met the cold immediately. A familiar contrast. Inside, the schoolhouse was already beginning to wake properly. The stove had been lit earlier, and faint warmth spread unevenly through the room. Some corners remained cold while the area near the iron stove already carried a gentle heat. A few early students were present. Not many yet. Just the ones who arrived before others, often older children or those with long distances to travel. They stood or sat quietly near their desks, waiting for the day to begin in full. One boy was adding wood to the fire with careful hands. Another girl wiped her boots near the doorway to avoid bringing in mud from the road. Small tasks. Simple routines. The teacher nodded in quiet greeting as they entered. No need for many words in these early moments. The room itself was still settling into the rhythm of the morning. Desks stood in neat rows. The blackboard waited, already faintly marked from yesterday until it would be cleaned again. Chalk dust lingered in corners like a memory of lessons already completed. The teacher moved to the stove first, checking the fire. Wood was adjusted slightly. A few embers encouraged back into brighter flame. Heat slowly expanded again, pushing back the cold that had collected overnight in the walls and floorboards. Then came the small preparations that always preceded the full arrival of students. Books placed carefully on the desk. Papers arranged in order. A glance toward the windows to judge the light. Outside, more children were beginning to appear along the road. Small figures walking in groups or alone, depending on distance and family. Some carried satchels over their shoulders. Others held lunch pails that swung gently with each step. Their voices were still faint at this distance, but growing closer. The school day was returning to life. One by one, students entered the schoolhouse. Cold air followed them briefly inside before fading into the warmth of the room. Greetings were exchanged in soft tones. Hats removed. Scarves loosened. Boots placed carefully near the entrance where mud would not spread across the floor. The teacher watched this familiar process without hurry. There was no need to rush the morning. Everything would unfold in its own steady order. Soon the room began to fill. Rows of children settling into desks. Soft conversation fading into quiet anticipation. The stove burning steadily now, giving the room its first true warmth of the day. The teacher walked slowly to the front. Morning had fully arrived. And with it, another day of lessons in the small schoolhouse began once again, just as it always had, and just as it would continue for many days to come. The morning lessons began in the same gentle order they always followed, as if the schoolhouse itself remembered the pattern and guided everyone back into it without needing instruction. Children settled into their desks. Books opened with soft paper sounds. Slates were taken out carefully, some still carrying faint marks from the day before that had not been fully erased. The stove burned steadily now, giving the room a stable warmth that slowly spread into every corner. It was never perfectly even. Near the stove it felt almost too warm, while by the windows a faint coldness still lingered, especially in winter. But over time, students learned how to adjust their clothing, their posture, and their attention to the changing air inside the room. The teacher stood quietly at the front for a moment before speaking. There was always a short pause like this at the beginning of the day. A moment where everything settled. Where voices softened. Where the outside world seemed to fade away behind wooden walls and the steady glow of firelight. Then the first lesson began. Reading. Always reading first for many rural schools, because it brought the room into a shared rhythm. Voices rose one by one, uneven at first, then slowly aligning into a steady flow. Some children read clearly and confidently. Others moved carefully through each word, sounding out letters as if building them piece by piece. The teacher listened closely, correcting gently when needed. Not sharply. Not in a way that broke the flow of the room. Just enough to guide. Just enough to help. Outside, the morning brightened further. Sunlight touched the fields beyond the windows, revealing pale frost still resting on grass and fence posts. A few birds moved across the sky, faint dark shapes against the widening blue. Inside, the schoolhouse remained its own small world. The teacher moved between desks as reading continued. A younger child hesitated over a word. The teacher leaned slightly closer and repeated it softly. The child tried again. This time it came more smoothly. A small moment, easily missed, but repeated many times throughout the day in different forms. That was how learning often happened here. Not in large sudden steps, but in small corrections. Small improvements. Small moments of understanding that slowly built over time. As reading lessons continued, some students began spelling practice at their seats. Others copied sentences from the board. Older students worked on arithmetic problems with steady concentration, heads bent low over slates. The room carried many activities at once, but all of them remained calm. No chaos. Only layered quiet movement. The teacher paused near a window for a moment, watching the countryside. The road outside had begun to soften as frost melted in the rising sun. Patches of mud reflected light faintly. A distant figure moved along the far edge of the field, likely someone heading toward town or another farm. Life beyond the schoolhouse continued at its own slow pace. Always present. Always ongoing. But inside, time felt more contained. More focused. The teacher returned to the center of the room and continued guiding the lessons. A spelling exercise began. Words spoken slowly. Repeated carefully. Written in small uneven lines across paper and slate. Morning. School. Winter. Quiet. Simple words that carried the world of the schoolhouse within them. The children repeated them softly, some with confidence, others with hesitation that slowly faded as practice continued. The teacher allowed the rhythm to carry forward. No need to hurry. No need to force. The morning would continue unfolding as it always did, steady and familiar, with each hour flowing naturally into the next. And the schoolhouse, warm now with fire and voices, remained gently alive beneath the pale light of the new day. As the morning continued, the schoolhouse settled deeper into its familiar rhythm, the kind that only developed after many small moments had already passed. The first excitement of arrival had faded. The stove now held steady warmth. The children had adjusted to their seats, their books, their routines, and the quiet expectation of lessons continuing without interruption. Outside the windows, sunlight strengthened slightly, touching the edges of the fields and melting the last stubborn traces of frost. The land looked softer now, less rigid than it had been in the early morning. Inside, the teacher moved calmly between subjects. Reading slowly shifted into writing practice. A fresh sentence was written on the blackboard, each letter formed carefully and evenly so that students could copy it as clearly as possible. The chalk made a soft scraping sound against the dark surface, leaving behind pale white lines that would soon become part of today's learning. The children opened their copybooks. Pens dipped into ink. A brief moment of silence followed, as if the room itself had taken a breath. Then writing began. Scratch by scratch. Line by line. The sound of pen against paper filled the schoolhouse in a steady, almost soothing rhythm. Some students wrote neatly from the beginning. Others paused often, erasing small mistakes and trying again without complaint. Ink occasionally blotched or spread too widely across rough paper, but even these imperfections were simply part of the process. The teacher walked slowly along the rows, observing. A slight correction here. A quiet encouragement there. A reminder to slow down. A reminder to press lighter. Everything was done in a calm tone, never breaking the overall stillness of the room. Outside, a faint breeze moved through the trees near the schoolhouse. It carried with it the sound of distant life, soft movement of branches, perhaps a bird calling briefly before flying out of sight. Inside, however, the world remained contained. Measured. Focused. After some time, writing practice gave way to arithmetic again. The teacher turned toward the blackboard and began writing simple problems. Numbers arranged carefully. Symbols placed with intention. Each one meant to guide the students through steady reasoning rather than quick answers. Older students leaned forward slightly, concentrating. Younger ones followed more slowly, sometimes copying steps without fully understanding yet, but learning through repetition and observation. The teacher did not rush them. Mathematics in a rural one-room schoolhouse was not about speed. It was about patience. Understanding formed gradually, like layers building over time. A boy near the middle row hesitated over a problem. The teacher approached quietly and looked at the slate beside him. No pressure. No urgency. Just a calm presence beside the desk. The explanation was given in simple steps. One part at a time. The boy nodded slowly and tried again, this time with more confidence. Nearby, another child finished early and sat quietly, waiting without distraction. These differences were normal. Every student moved at their own pace. The teacher had learned to hold all of these small timelines together in the same room without letting any of them feel rushed or left behind. Outside, the sun climbed a little higher. The schoolhouse grew slightly brighter. Dust in the air became visible in thin golden lines where light passed through the windows. The stove continued its steady work, keeping the room balanced between cold and warmth. As the lesson progressed, the teacher allowed a short pause. A moment for stretching. For rest. For the natural movement that children needed after sitting too long. Chairs shifted softly. Hands relaxed. A few quiet whispers appeared and faded just as quickly. Then the teacher called the room back into attention. The next reading exercise began. This one slower. Calmer. Almost like a shared recitation that allowed voices to blend gently together rather than stand alone. Words rose and fell in a soft collective rhythm. Not perfect. Not uniform. but steady enough to carry the room forward. And as the morning moved closer toward midday once again, the schoolhouse remained peaceful in its familiar way, filled with small human effort unfolding quietly beneath the slow light of the day. By late morning, the light in the schoolhouse had changed again. It was no longer the pale, uncertain glow of early day. It had become steadier now, filling the room with a soft clarity that made the wooden desks, the chalkboard, and even the drifting dust in the air feel more present, more defined. The stove still held warmth, but the room had reached a kind of balance. Neither too cold nor too warm. Just enough comfort for the children to continue working without distraction. The teacher moved slowly back toward the front of the room. The lessons shifted once more. Reading had ended for the moment, and now came recitation. A familiar part of the school day, where memory mattered more than written work, and where voices carried knowledge out loud into the shared space. One by one, students stood beside their desks. A simple rhythm formed. A question from the teacher. A response from the student. Sometimes correct. Sometimes uncertain. Always patient. Always corrected gently when needed. The room remained quiet even during mistakes. There was no harsh interruption, only the steady guiding voice of the teacher helping each child find the right answer step by step. Outside, the countryside continued its slow movement through the morning. A faint breeze passed over the fields, bending dry grass and carrying the sound of distant water flowing somewhere beyond sight. The road near the schoolhouse remained mostly empty, though occasionally a figure could be seen far away, moving between farms or heading toward town. Inside, time felt different. Contained. Measured by lessons instead of hours. A boy near the back of the room struggled slightly during recitation. His voice lowered halfway through a line, uncertain of the next part. He shifted on his feet, glancing briefly toward his book. The teacher waited. Not rushing him. Not pressuring him. Just allowing the memory to return on its own. After a moment, the boy continued, finishing the passage with a quieter but steady voice. A small nod from the teacher marked the completion. No praise spoken loudly. Only acknowledgement. Then the next student stood. And the rhythm continued. In many ways, the schoolhouse functioned like this throughout the entire day. A cycle of attention, rest, focus, and gentle correction. Even when children grew restless or tired, the structure of the room held them together. Near the front, a younger child traced letters with a finger on the desk surface while waiting for their turn. Another adjusted their posture repeatedly, trying to stay attentive as fatigue slowly returned. The teacher noticed all of it without interrupting the flow of lessons. Experience had taught how to see many things at once. A classroom was never just the student speaking. It was also the ones waiting. The ones listening. The ones quietly struggling but still trying. As recitation ended, the teacher turned once more to the blackboard. A final set of exercises for the morning was written carefully across its surface. Simple arithmetic problems. A short reading passage. A spelling review. Nothing overwhelming. Just enough to keep minds active as the morning reached its final stretch. The children returned to their seats and began working again. Pens scratched softly. Slates tapped lightly against wood. Pages turned with slow, careful movements. Outside, the sun had climbed higher now, and the fields beyond the windows were fully awake in daylight. Shadows were shorter. The air looked clearer. Even the distant trees seemed more defined against the sky. Inside, the schoolhouse remained steady. A small world of learning suspended between morning and afternoon. And as the final minutes before midday approached, everything inside the room carried a quiet sense of completion, as if the school day itself was gently preparing to pause once again before continuing its long, familiar flow. As midday approached, the schoolhouse began to change its feeling once again, slowly and almost unnoticeably, like the shift of light across a wall. The sharper focus of morning lessons softened. Children who had been sitting upright with concentration now leaned back slightly in their chairs. The steady rhythm of writing and recitation eased into quieter movements, as if the room itself was taking a gentle breath before the next pause in the day. The teacher noticed this shift without needing to say anything at first. It was always the same. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Just a gradual settling of attention as hunger and fatigue from the morning began to show. The stove continued to glow steadily, though the warmth now felt more familiar than necessary. Outside, sunlight was stronger, reaching deeper into the room through the tall windows and casting pale rectangles across the wooden floorboards. Dust still drifted slowly through the air, visible whenever the light caught it at just the right angle. The teacher closed the book that had been used for the final morning exercise. A simple motion, but one that immediately changed the mood of the room. Several children understood at once what that meant. Lunch was near. A small shift passed through the desks. Books were gathered more carefully now. Slates were cleaned or stacked. Some students already reached for their lunch pails, though they waited for permission before fully opening them. The teacher spoke calmly. A short instruction. A gentle reminder to prepare quietly. And then, slowly, the room relaxed into midday pause. Lunch in a rural 1800s schoolhouse was never hurried. It was simple. Practical. Carried from home in cloth wraps, tin containers, or small baskets depending on the family's means. The children opened their meals with familiar care. Bread wrapped in soft cloth. Apples saved from storage. Cold potatoes or leftover porridge. Small pieces of meat or cheese when available. Each item carried the quiet effort of the home it came from. The room filled with soft sounds. Not loud conversation. Just gentle eating. Occasional whispers. The rustle of cloth being unfolded and refolded. The faint clink of tin pails being set on wooden desks. The teacher remained near the front, organizing papers and briefly reviewing notes for the afternoon lessons. There was always something to prepare. Always something to adjust. Teaching in a one-room schoolhouse was never divided cleanly into teaching time and rest time. Even during breaks, the teacher remained within the flow of the day, watching, adjusting, thinking ahead. Outside, the countryside was calm. The fields were brighter now under midday sun, though a slight coolness still lingered in the air. A few birds moved between fence posts, and far in the distance, faint movement suggested a wagon traveling slowly along a road beyond the trees. Inside, the children continued their quiet meal. A few leaned toward the windows while eating, watching the light shift across the ground outside. Others stayed focused on their food, careful not to waste anything. Waste was uncommon in rural households. Everything had value. Even small crumbs. Even scraps of cloth. Even time. One child carefully shared part of their meal with a younger sibling sitting nearby, breaking bread into even pieces before placing them between them on the desk. The teacher noticed this but did not interrupt. Such moments were part of daily life. Small gestures of care that rarely needed comment. As lunch continued, the room grew more relaxed. A few students spoke softly about home. About chores waiting later in the day. About animals to feed. About weather that might change again before evening. The teacher listened quietly while turning pages of a notebook. Outside, the sun remained steady, though its angle suggested the day was already moving past its center. The pause would not last forever. It never did. Eventually, the teacher would call the room back into order. Books would reopen. Lessons would resume. And the quiet structure of the school day would continue its steady path toward evening once again. But for now, in this small moment between morning effort and afternoon learning, the schoolhouse remained calm and warm, filled with simple food, soft voices, and the peaceful stillness of midday rest. After a time, the quiet sounds of lunch began to fade. Not all at once, but gradually, as children finished eating and carefully folded away the small pieces of cloth or closed their tin pails with gentle clicks. The room shifted again, returning slowly from rest back toward structure, as if the schoolhouse itself was remembering the next part of the day. The teacher waited patiently. There was no need to hurry this transition. Midday in a rural schoolhouse always carried its own natural timing. Some children needed a little longer. Some finished quickly and sat quietly, watching the others. A few remained near the windows, looking out at the brightened fields beyond the glass. Outside, the light had become stronger still. The frost that once clung to the morning grass was now gone, replaced by soft damp earth and the faint shine of melting water along the edges of the road. The countryside looked more open now, less frozen, more alive in a quiet winter way. Inside, the stove continued to glow, though it no longer felt like the center of attention. It was simply part of the room again, steady and familiar. One by one, children returned their focus. Desks were cleared. Books were reopened. Slates were set back into place. The teacher moved to the front of the room and stood there for a moment in silence. That silence mattered. It marked the return. Then, gently, the afternoon began. The first lesson after lunch was often simpler than the morning work. Something to ease the children back into focus. A reading exercise, or sometimes a short review of what had been learned earlier in the week. The teacher opened a worn book once again. The pages were familiar by now. Edges softened from repeated use. Ink slightly faded in places where many eyes had passed over the same lines for years. A passage was chosen. The teacher read it aloud first. Slowly. Clearly. Not to impress. Only to guide. Then the children followed. Voices rose again across the room, softer at first, then more confident as the rhythm returned. The sound filled the schoolhouse gently, blending with the faint crackle of the stove and the distant quiet of the world outside. Reading after lunch had a different feeling than reading in the morning. There was less sharpness. Less urgency. More steadiness. A kind of calm repetition that helped the mind settle back into learning after rest. As the lesson continued, the teacher moved slowly between desks again. A child adjusted their posture, still slightly sleepy from the warmth of the stove and the comfort of lunch. Another turned a page carefully, trying not to crease it. A younger student traced each word with a finger while reading aloud in a quiet voice. The teacher corrected gently when needed. A missed word. A soft reminder. A careful pronunciation repeated once more. Nothing interrupted the flow. Everything remained steady. Outside, the sky had cleared further. Light clouds drifted high above the fields, thin and slow-moving. The wind had become lighter than before, barely noticeable now except in the occasional sway of tree branches along the edges of the schoolyard. Inside, the room felt balanced again. Not as lively as morning. Not as still as lunch. Something in between. A working calm. The teacher eventually closed the reading book and placed it back on the desk. A short arithmetic review followed. Simple problems written on the board. Numbers that required attention but not strain. The children leaned forward again, re-entering focus. Pencils moved. Slates clicked softly. Thought returned to structure. And the teacher, standing at the front of the room, continued guiding the day forward in its slow, familiar rhythm, knowing that each hour would carry them gradually toward evening once again, just as it always did. The afternoon settled into its deeper rhythm now, the kind that comes after lunch has passed and the energy of the day begins to quiet again. The schoolhouse felt steady, almost unchanging. Yet time was still moving forward, measured not by clocks in every moment, but by the gradual shift of light across the floor and the soft progression of lessons from one subject into another. The teacher returned to the blackboard once more. Chalk in hand. A few simple arithmetic problems were written again, slightly more challenging than before, but still within the calm structure of the day. Numbers lined up carefully. Symbols placed with attention. Everything clear enough for children of different ages to follow in their own way. The students leaned in. Some confident. Some uncertain. All attentive. A quiet scratch of pencils and slate filled the room again as work resumed. The teacher moved slowly among the rows, observing without interruption unless needed. A child hesitated over subtraction. Another carefully checked their answer twice before writing it down. One younger student counted softly under their breath, lips moving slightly as fingers traced invisible steps along the edge of the desk. This was the kind of learning that filled most of the afternoon. Not sudden understanding, but steady repetition. Careful practice. The kind that stayed with a person long after childhood ended. Outside, the countryside had changed subtly again. The sun had shifted lower, though still bright. Shadows had lengthened slightly across the fields. The light now felt softer, less direct, touching the edges of trees and fences in a gentler tone. A distant sound of movement passed briefly along the road. A wagon perhaps. Or a traveler moving between farms. It faded quickly, swallowed again by the wide quiet of the land. Inside, the stove continued its quiet presence. Not as intense as morning, but still warm enough to keep the room comfortable. Occasionally a small crackle would break the silence, reminding everyone of its steady work at the center of the space. The teacher paused for a moment near the window. Just briefly. Looking out without urgency. The fields beyond were calm. No sudden changes. No signs of storm. Just the slow, ordinary life of countryside afternoon unfolding in its own time. That steadiness carried back into the room. The teacher turned again. Another exercise was introduced. This time a mixture of reading and writing together. A short passage written on the board. The children were asked to copy it carefully, then read it aloud in turn. The room responded immediately. Books opened. Ink was prepared. Pages turned. The sound of writing returned, soft and continuous, like rain against a roof but quieter, more deliberate. Scratch. Pause. Correct. Continue. The teacher watched carefully, moving between desks with quiet attention. A child near the center had smudged ink across part of the page and looked briefly worried. The teacher simply handed a clean scrap of paper and showed where to continue. No interruption beyond that. No stress added to the moment. Just continuation. Always continuation. That was how the day flowed. Mistakes were not stops. Only pauses before trying again. Outside, the sky began to soften slightly toward the west. The light was changing again, hinting that afternoon was slowly beginning its long approach toward evening. Inside the schoolhouse, no one spoke of it yet. But everyone felt it in some quiet way. The teacher knew the rhythm well. There would be one more shift in lessons. Then another pause. Then the final stretch of the day. And so the room continued, calm and steady, carrying its small community of learners forward through the last quiet hours of the afternoon. The afternoon grew quieter again as the lessons moved into their final stretch. It was a subtle change, not marked by any clear moment, but felt in the way the children's movements slowed just a little more, and how their voices during reading or recitation softened as if the room itself was becoming heavier with the passing hours. Outside, the light had begun its slow descent. The sun was still present, but lower now, touching the fields at a longer angle. Shadows stretched farther across the ground beyond the schoolhouse windows. The trees looked darker at their bases, their upper branches still holding the pale glow of late afternoon. Inside, the stove continued to give steady warmth, though fewer children gathered near it now. Most had settled into the final work of the day, aware that the long hours were beginning to reach their end. The teacher stood at the front for a moment in silence. A familiar pause. The kind that signaled transition. Then came reading once more. Not loud. Not hurried. Just steady voices moving through a passage chosen to carry the room toward closure rather than challenge. Children read in turns. One after another. Some with confidence. Some with careful hesitation. The teacher corrected gently when needed, but more often simply listened, allowing the rhythm of speech to carry through the quiet space. A younger child near the window blinked slowly, fighting off the last edges of afternoon tiredness. Another rested their chin briefly on folded arms before straightening again when their turn approached. This was the time of day when attention naturally softened. The teacher did not resist it. Instead, the lessons adjusted with it. After reading, there was a final spelling review. Simple words. Familiar words. Words already seen many times throughout the day. Field. School. Winter. Home. Each one spoken slowly, repeated carefully, then spelled aloud in soft voices. The room responded with quiet effort. Not excitement. Not strain. Just steady completion. Outside, the wind shifted slightly, brushing through the trees near the schoolhouse. A few remaining leaves or dry twigs moved gently, producing faint sounds that barely reached inside. The countryside was preparing for evening in its own slow way. Farm animals would soon be gathered. Fires would be tended. Doors closed against the growing chill. Inside, the teacher turned toward the blackboard once more. The final instructions of the day were written clearly. Assignments for tomorrow. Simple reminders. Nothing overwhelming. Just enough to guide the next morning's beginning. The children watched as the chalk moved across the board, then copied carefully into books or memorized quietly in place. There was a feeling in the room now that everyone recognized. The end of the school day was approaching. Not yet complete, but close. The teacher stepped back from the board and looked across the room. Desk still in order. Books still open. Faces still attentive, though clearly more tired now than at the beginning of the day. The stove glowed steadily at the center of it all. A final warmth holding the room together. Outside, the sky continued its slow shift toward evening. And inside the schoolhouse, everything moved gently toward that final moment when learning would pause once again, and the children would return to their homes along the quiet country roads. The last part of the afternoon always felt different, even when nothing in the room truly changed. It was still the same schoolhouse. The same desks. The same stove holding its steady warmth. But something in the atmosphere shifted, like the day itself was slowly lowering its voice. The teacher could feel it clearly now. The children could too. Lessons continued, but with a softer edge, as if everything was moving carefully toward completion without needing to be rushed. The final reading exercise was given. A familiar passage. Not difficult. Not new. Just steady words meant to bring closure to the day's learning. Voices rose once again across the room, but more gently than before. Some students read with clear confidence, while others moved carefully through each sentence, their energy nearly spent after the long hours since morning. The teacher listened without interruption. Only small corrections were made when needed. A word repeated softly. A pause guided forward. Outside, the light had changed again. The sun was now lower, nearing the horizon. The sky held a soft, pale glow that filtered through the windows in long rectangular shapes across the floor. Shadows in the corners of the room grew deeper, while the center remained warm and lit by the stove. Dust floated slowly through the air, visible in the fading light. The teacher closed the reading book after the final passage was completed. A quiet moment followed. No one spoke immediately. It was not silence out of instruction, but silence out of shared understanding. The day was nearing its end. Then came the final arithmetic review. Simple problems, already familiar, given once more not to challenge but to reinforce what had been learned throughout the day. Children worked quietly. Pens moved with less urgency now. Some checked their answers twice. Others simply reviewed what they had already written earlier. The teacher walked slowly between desks, observing. A child adjusted a number carefully after a gentle reminder. Another corrected a small mistake without being told, realizing it on their own. These small moments marked the closing rhythm of the day. Outside, the countryside was shifting toward evening fully now. The fields darkened slightly as shadows lengthened. A faint breeze moved across the land, carrying the smell of damp earth and distant wood smoke as households began preparing their evening fires. Inside, the stove still burned, but its purpose was changing. It was no longer just about warmth for lessons. It was becoming the final comfort before departure. The teacher returned to the front of the room and looked across the students once more. Everyone was present. Everyone quiet. Everyone aware, in their own way, that the final moment was near. The teacher spoke softly. A few final instructions were given. Books to be closed. Desks to be cleared. Tomorrow's expectations briefly reminded. Then came the pause. That familiar pause before dismissal. It always felt longer than it was. A small space of stillness where the entire day seemed to gather itself one last time. And then, slowly, the schoolhouse prepared to end its day again, just as it had done so many times before, and just as it would continue to do in the quiet rhythm of days still waiting ahead. The final pause lingered in the schoolhouse like a held breath. Everything had already been said. Everything already practiced. Yet the room remained still for a few seconds longer, as if even the wooden walls and old floorboards understood the importance of this small silence before release. The teacher stood at the front, calm and steady. The children sat quietly in their desks, hands resting on books or folded neatly, waiting for the familiar signal that the day had truly ended. Outside, the evening light had deepened. It was no longer bright. Not fully dark either. That in-between time when the countryside begins to soften into shadow and distant lights in farmhouses slowly appear like small warm points across the land. The stove inside the schoolhouse gave one last steady glow, as if holding on to the day a little longer. Then, gently, the teacher closed the final book. A simple sound, but enough. The room shifted immediately. Desks opened with soft movement. Books were gathered carefully. Slates were wiped clean or placed into bags. The rustle of coats and scarves filled the space as children prepared for departure. There was no rush in the teacher's voice. Only calm reminders. Careful words about the muddy roads. About walking safely. About returning home before full darkness settled too heavily over the fields. One by one, the children stood. They moved toward the door in small groups, just as they always did. Some left alone. Some walked together, siblings or neighbors staying close for the journey home. Boots tapped softly against the wooden floor near the exit. A few faint voices returned briefly as excitement replaced the quiet discipline of the classroom. The teacher stood near the doorway, watching each child leave. This part of the day always carried a quiet responsibility. Not just ending lessons, but seeing them safely on their way. Outside, the world had turned fully into evening now. The sky was dim, stretched in soft layers of gray and fading blue. The fields were darker, but still visible. And beyond them, scattered farmhouse windows glowed warmly in the distance. Children stepped into that evening one by one. Lanterns appeared in small hands for those who walked farther roads. Groups formed naturally along familiar paths. The sound of voices drifted briefly through the air before slowly fading into the countryside. The schoolhouse grew quieter with every departure. Until at last, only a few remained. Then none. Just the teacher and the empty room. The door closed softly. And silence returned. But it was not an empty silence. It was the kind that carries memory. The echo of voices that had filled the space only moments before. The faint warmth still held within the stove. The impression of a full day now complete. The teacher walked slowly back through the room. Desks aligned in rows. Chalkboard faintly marked. Dust settling in the fading light. Everything familiar. Everything in its place. The teacher paused for a moment near the center of the room. There was always this moment after dismissal. A quiet reflection without words. Not about anything large or dramatic. Just the small passing of a day. Lessons given. Effort made. Children learning in their own ways, at their own pace. Outside, the wind moved lightly across the fields. Inside, the stove's glow began to dim slightly as wood settled into embers. The schoolhouse remained warm, but gently so, like it was resting after long work. The teacher took a slow breath, then turned once more toward the desk to begin the quiet final tasks of the evening. But even those tasks felt different now. Slower. Calmer. As if the entire building was exhaling alongside the person within it. Another day had ended. And the quiet rhythm of tomorrow waited patiently beyond the night. Even after the children had gone, the schoolhouse did not feel fully empty at once. It still held the shape of the day. The warmth lingering in uneven patches of air. The faint scent of ink and chalk dust. The quiet memory of many small voices speaking and reading and trying their best only moments before. The teacher moved slowly between the rows of desks, as was always done at the end of the day. This part of the routine was never rushed. A forgotten slate pencil was picked up from beneath a desk. A folded paper slipped back into place. A chair straightened gently that had been left slightly turned. Small things. Ordinary things. But each one a part of keeping the room ready for tomorrow. Outside, evening deepened further. The sky had shifted into darker tones now, with only the last traces of light resting low near the horizon. The fields were nearly indistinguishable except for faint outlines of trees and fences, softened by distance and shadow. Inside, the stove still gave a quiet glow. Not bright like before. Only embers now. Enough to hold warmth in the room for a while longer. The teacher added a final piece of wood, more out of habit than necessity, and listened to the soft crackle as it caught. That sound marked the continuation of the evening routine. Not the school day anymore, but the closing of it. The teacher returned to the desk and began the remaining work. Attendance records were checked carefully. Names reviewed. Notes from the day written in simple lines. A reminder about one child who seemed unusually quiet. Another who had improved slightly in reading. Small observations that would matter again when tomorrow began. The pen moved slowly across the page. Measured. Calm. Outside, the wind brushed lightly against the walls of the schoolhouse. It was not a strong wind. Just enough to remind that the world beyond still continued its quiet movement through night. Occasionally, a distant sound reached the building. Perhaps a wagon passing far down the road. Perhaps a farm animal moving in a barn. Then silence again. Inside, the lamp was lit once more to replace the fading daylight completely. Its soft glow spread across the desk, turning the wooden surface into something warmer, more intimate, as if the room itself had shrunk slightly into a smaller, quieter space. The teacher paused for a moment while writing and looked around. Empty desks. Neatly arranged. The blackboard now fully erased. The classroom restored to order, waiting patiently for morning. There was a familiar comfort in this sight. A sense of completion. Not perfection. Just readiness. The teacher closed the notebook gently. There was nothing more urgent left for the day. Only the final leaving. Outside, the night had fully arrived now. The countryside lay still beneath it, covered in darkness but not emptiness. Life continued in distant homes, in warm kitchens, in quiet barns where animals settled for the night. The teacher stood, gathering coat and belongings. The lamp was lowered slightly. The stove checked one last time. Everything prepared for the night's absence. At the door, there was a final pause. A habit formed from repetition. A quiet glance back into the room. The schoolhouse stood calm and still, holding the shape of the day that had just passed through it. Then the teacher stepped outside. The door closed softly behind. And the evening air welcomed everything into its quiet, open darkness once again. The night outside felt deeper now than it had earlier in the evening. Not colder in any sudden way, but more complete, as if the world had fully settled into its nighttime shape. The schoolhouse stood behind the teacher like a quiet shadowed memory, its windows dim, its structure still warm inside from the long day that had passed. The teacher began walking along the familiar road. Each step felt slower now. Not from difficulty, but from release. The day's work was finished, and the body carried that familiar heaviness that comes after hours of standing, speaking, guiding, and listening. The lantern was held steady. Its small circle of light moved gently over the uneven ground, revealing patches of dirt, small stones, and shallow ruts softened by earlier rain. Beyond that light, the countryside remained quiet and dark. The fields stretched outward in soft shapes that could barely be seen. Trees stood like still silhouettes. Occasionally, a faint sound broke the silence. A distant rustle in the grass. The soft call of a night bird. Then stillness again. The teacher walked this road many times, and yet it never felt exactly the same twice. Weather changed it. Seasons changed it. Even the inner feeling of the day changed how the journey home felt. Tonight, everything felt particularly calm. The air was still. The sky above was open, showing scattered stars through thin drifting clouds. Each one appeared briefly and then softened again as clouds passed across them. The lantern light flickered slightly with the wind, but remained steady enough to guide the path forward. As the teacher walked, thoughts drifted quietly. Not structured thoughts. Just gentle impressions. A student finally understanding a difficult passage after many attempts. The sound of children reading together in soft unison. The feeling of warm air near the stove during the coldest part of the afternoon. These memories moved through the mind without urgency, like pages turning slowly in a book that did not need to be read quickly. Ahead, the farmhouse came into view again. Its windows glowed warmly in the distance. A familiar sight. A place of temporary rest between long days of teaching. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, blending into the night sky. The teacher approached the gate and paused briefly, as always, before entering. A moment of transition. From open road to sheltered home. From night air to indoor warmth. Inside, life continued in its quiet evening rhythm. Soft movement. Low conversation. The faint sound of fire shifting in the hearth. The teacher stepped inside, and warmth returned immediately, wrapping around the cold carried from outside. The contrast was always noticeable. Almost gentle in its comfort. Boots were set aside near the door. The coat hung carefully. The lantern dimmed and placed down. Greetings were exchanged in calm, familiar tones. Nothing rushed. Nothing unnecessary. The household had already settled into its own night routine. A meal had likely been prepared earlier and now waited quietly or had already been shared. The teacher joined the simple warmth of the room. Firelight reflected softly across wooden walls. Shadows moved slowly as flames shifted in the hearth. A chair was offered near the fire. A place to rest without demand. Outside, the wind continued its gentle movement through the trees, but it no longer reached inside. Here, everything was still. Time itself felt slower in these evening hours, as if the world had agreed to pause its urgency until morning returned again. The teacher sat quietly, allowing the body to rest. The day had been long. But not heavy in a harsh way. More like a long path walked steadily from beginning to end. And now, at last, there was stillness. A quiet evening continuing forward, softly and unhurried, beneath the steady glow of firelight and the distant, patient night outside. The fire in the hearth settled into a steady glow, no longer rising in quick bursts of flame, but holding a calm, constant warmth that filled the farmhouse in a gentle way. The evening had fully taken over now. Outside, the night was complete. Inside, time felt softened again, like it did every night after the long work of the day was finished. The teacher remained seated for a while, simply resting. No tasks. No lessons. No voices of students asking questions or repeating words from a blackboard. Only the quiet of a home at night, and the slow sound of fire shifting as wood turned into embers. The family moved about their final evening routines in a calm rhythm. A cup set down softly near the table. A chair adjusted slightly. A low conversation that faded into silence without needing to be continued. Even small sounds felt slower at this hour. More deliberate. Less necessary. The teacher watched the fire for a moment longer. The glow reflected faintly against the worn surfaces of the room. Shadows moved gently along the walls whenever the flames shifted. It was a familiar sight now, the same kind of fire seen in countless rural homes across the countryside during the 1800s. Simple, useful, comforting. The teacher's thoughts drifted again, not in any structured direction, but in soft fragments. The classroom in the morning light. The sound of children reading together. The careful writing of letters across paper. The quiet hesitation before a student found the right answer. These small moments returned gently, not as tasks, but as impressions. The kind that stay long after the day has ended. Outside, somewhere far beyond the farmhouse, the land remained still. Fences and fields resting in darkness. Roads empty. Barns quiet. Only occasional movement from small animals or wind through dry grass. Life continued, but slowly, without urgency. The teacher eventually rose from the chair. Not because rest was over, but because the evening routine always had its final steps. A simple meal might be finished or set aside. A basin of water used for washing away the dust of the day. Hands rinsed. Face cooled. Small actions that marked the transition from the working hours of teaching into the quiet hours of sleep. Everything was done without hurry. The farmhouse itself seemed to accept this rhythm. Each movement inside it felt natural, as if the house understood the need for slow endings. Upstairs, the room prepared for sleep once again. The candle waited on its small table. The bed remained neatly arranged. The window showed only darkness now, with faint outlines of trees barely visible against the night sky. The teacher moved through these final steps of preparation quietly. Clothing adjusted. Belongings set aside. The day fully released. Downstairs, the fire continued to glow, though dimmer now. It would soon be left to its natural fading state, holding warmth through the night without attention. The household had entered its resting phase. A stillness that felt complete but not empty. Outside, the wind softened further. Even the trees seemed quieter now, their movement reduced to the smallest suggestion of motion. The teacher stood for a moment near the bed, looking toward the window. No thoughts of urgency remained. Only the sense of a full day completed. Morning lessons. Afternoon work. Evening return. All of it forming a steady rhythm that would come again tomorrow in the same gentle order. The candle was lit briefly, then allowed to glow softly as the room grew darker around it. And in that quiet light, the teacher finally settled into rest once more, as the farmhouse returned fully to night, and the countryside outside continued its slow, peaceful silence beneath the stars. The candle burned with a small, steady flame. Not bright. Not flickering with urgency. Just quiet light holding its place in the darkness of the room. Everything else had already settled. The farmhouse was still now, the way it becomes when every task of the day has been completed and nothing remains except rest. Downstairs, the last warmth of the hearth had softened into embers. Up here, the air was cooler, but calm, as if the night itself had agreed to be gentle. The teacher lay still. Breathing slow. Thoughts no longer forming into anything structured or clear. Only fragments remained for a while. The sound of children reading in the morning. The soft scratching of ink on paper. The warm heaviness of afternoon light across wooden desks. The quiet walk home beneath a wide, dark sky. And then, even those fragments began to fade. The room did not demand anything. The world outside did not call. There was only the steady presence of night. Time moved in a way that no longer felt measured. It simply passed. Softly. Without attention. The candle lowered slightly as the flame consumed the last of its fuel, casting longer shadows for a moment across the wall. Then even that movement became less noticeable, as if the room was sinking deeper into stillness. The teacher's awareness drifted further away from the day. From the schoolhouse. From the roads and fields and small routines that had filled every hour. All of it remained, but no longer close. Like something placed gently down and left undisturbed. Outside, the countryside continued its quiet existence beneath the stars. No sound reached the window now. Only wind moving far away through trees that no one was watching. Only night holding everything in its soft, wide calm. Inside, the final warmth of wakefulness slowly dissolved. Not suddenly. Not completely in any one moment. Just gradually, like the closing of a long and familiar book. The candle dimmed. The room darkened. And the last edges of thought became still. There was no ending that needed to be spoken. No conclusion that needed to be reached. Only the simple passing of time into rest. And in that rest, the long day that began in the quiet morning schoolhouse finally came to its soft and complete silence.